Hi everyone, I'm Lena Rao and this is my Psych Files podcast. Welcome, and I hope you're all having a great day today and you're wanting to listen to an interesting topic, because today's topic is true crime, where I want to focus on the story of serial killer Robert Black. Now there's going to be a trigger warning here. This story contains a child killer, a sexual abuser and a rapist. And if this is something that makes you feel uncomfortable, I suggest you skip this story. A serial killer is a person that has killed 3 or more people with a rest period in between killings. Now, Robert Black raped and murdered 4 young girls across the UK, but investigators believe that he was the killer of many other girls that were missing at the time. Black died at the age of 68 in January of 2016 in jail whilst he was serving 12 life sentences. So let's all just say good riddance to him, because he is not going to be missed. Before we get into the crimes committed by Robert, I'd like to take some time to talk to you about his early life. As a psychology student, I believe that evil people are not born evil but are made evil due to the environment and the experience they had growing up. And although this is often the case, I do not condone any of the actions talked about in this podcast, and know full well that not everyone who has experienced an abusive childhood turns into a murderer or rapist. In my opinion, this man is a monster, and he is one of the lowest forms of people you could think of. Now back to the story. Robert Black was born in Scotland, a place called Grangemouth, Stirlingshire, on the 21st of April 1947, making him a Taurus. Robert was the illegitimate son of Jesse Hunter Black, as Robert's father was not in the picture and was unknown to his mother. Unfortunately, during this time there was a stigma about women who had children and that were not married at the time. Jessie, Rob's mother, planned on giving Robert up for adoption and moving to Australia to escape the stigma and start afresh. It's likely that she'd pretend that Rob never existed, and actually in the future of this story later on she does actually have 4 children with another man and gets married. Now I'm not sure if Jessie really had any choice in the matter, but with the evidence that I just said, she probably did, and she probably just wanted to forget about him. I know some women who were pregnant out of wedlock were placed into psych wards back then, and this could have possibly been the reason why. But sadly, Rob was never actually adopted, and they ended up placed with a foster family, and this was a middle-aged couple from Kinloch Leven with the last name Tulip, which he adopted later on in life. Robert was known to be a very aggressive child and was a bit of an outcast with only a few friends. He was known to vandalise his school, throw tantrums and bully children younger than himself. But this didn't stop the children of his own age targeting him, and they would bully him. Bobby was often taunted and called Smelly Bobby Tulip, and this wasn't due to any sort of neglect from his foster family. This was due to the fact that he just had really poor hygiene, and this is something that comes up later on in the story. There was an event that happened when Robert was around 5 years old. Him and a girl of the same age compared genitalia, and this generally is seen as sort of a normal part of growing up. Children often do compare the genitalia at a certain age. But when Robert saw the little girl's genitalia, he became jealous of the little girl, realising that he wished he was born a female. This led Rob to have a deep interest in genitalia, and from the age of 8 he would regularly insert objects into his anus. Black was often seen by the locals to have bruising to his face, and Black would say this was due to having fights at school. But Black was regularly berated and beaten by his foster mother, and he was also a bedwetter. Bedwetting is often an occurrence with serial killers or murderers in general. Could this be due to a fear of being beaten? This lack of control as a child could have led these people to wanting to place their anger at someone else. A lot of the time serial killers like the feeling of being in control and being more powerful than others, probably due to the lack of control they had as children. Now if Rob was bedwetting and maybe getting berated for bedwetting, this may have led to an anal retention, which may be the reason for the obsession with inserting objects into his anus. But this is a very Freudian theory. By 1958, both of the Tulips had passed away. His stepdad actually died at the age of 5, and his stepmother died when he was 12 years old. And due to this, Robert was placed in another foster family in Kinlochleven. I don't actually have the name for this family, but this was where Rob committed his first crime. Rob dragged a young girl into a public toilet and sexually assaulted her. This was in the form of fondling her. At this time, his new foster mother reported the offence and made sure that Robert was removed from the care immediately. Black was then placed into a mixed-gendered children's home on the outskirts of Falkirk. During his time there, he exposed himself to a girl and was forcibly removed from the care home and taken to Red House Care Home. Now, Red House was known to be a very high-disciplined, all-male establishment, and this was in Musselburgh, Scotland. And he was enlisted as Boy 28. Being enlisted as a number clearly shows a removal of identity, and this would make anyone feel unwanted, unloved and unseen. Never mind being abandoned by your own mother and taken into care. This could have led to more depersonalisation for Rob, a lack of identity, only being treated like an unwanted burden. As he was a teenager at the time, a theory by Erik Erikson suggests that this is a time where children have an identity crisis and where they learn to either accept themselves for who they are or be ashamed and embarrassed for themselves. And this is where they can develop a low self-esteem. The lack of a steady home and the lack of identity and care could have led Robert to developing a psychopathic personality. Along with the abuse he had faced from his foster mother, this could also have led him to developing a bad schemer of women. And as the only two he relied on left him or abused him, it's not a surprise that he did. And this is possibly why he showed little to no respect to women. But during his time at Red House, Black was being sexually assaulted by a male staff member, typically being made to perform sexual acts on the staff member, and this was usually in the form of fellatio. This must have made him feel so hopeless and unable to trust anyone. There would have been no one to turn to, and he was likely scared in the only place that he could find shelter. Whilst Robert was living in Red House, he attended Musselburgh Grammar School, where other students described him as being reserved and a bit of a loner. This is often a personality type that comes with being a murderer, unfortunately, and oftentimes murderers do actually get bullied in school. And in this case, not only was he rejected by his own mother, he was rejected by his peers as well. But in 1963, when Robert would have been approximately 16 years old, he was moved to another boys' school in Greenock and got a job as a butcher's delivery boy. Later on, Robert admitted to fondling or groping over 40 young girls whilst he had this job. He did this when he was delivering meat to the house, although none of these incidents were actually reported. In the summer of 1963, Robert came across a 7-year-old girl playing alone in a local park. He then lured her to a deserted air raid shelter. This was under the pretext that he would show her some kittens. Very manipulative behaviour. And bear in mind, he's only 16 at the time. Robert then choked the girl until she lost consciousness and then masturbated over her unconscious body. Now, it's not known if Robert actually knew she was dead or alive at that point. So this should show some very concerning sexual behaviours from Robert. But Robert was assessed by a psychiatrist who suggested this was an isolated incident, and Robert was arrested for lewd and libidinous behaviour. Now, for me, that's more of a sexual assault. I mean, what even is libidinous behaviour? When I actually searched this up, it said that it's basically like, exposing yourself in public. But this is a bit more than exposing yourself. Not only are you exposing yourself, you're actually physically harming someone. You are rendering someone unconscious. That is classed surely as an assault. And being masturbated over as well is surely sexual abuse. Shortly after this, Robert moved back to Grangemouth. This is where Robert was born. He ended up lodging in an elderly couple's house and got a job at the builder's supply company. During this time, he met his first girlfriend, who I don't actually have the name of, but he met her in a local youth club. This is the only known girlfriend of Robert's, and they were only together for a few months. Apparently he asked her to marry him and she rejected him, which devastated Robert as she abruptly broke up with him straight after this. The reason being that he displayed unusual sexual demands of her. Now, previously obviously speaking about this 7-year-old girl, it's likely that he actually was, because that's not normal behaviour. People don't go and find young girls and, choke them until they're unconscious. It's not normal behaviour. This is unusual. People don't go out doing this every day. So it's likely, or it could be likely, that he was wanting to choke her, which for some people would be very uncomfortable. And it's a risk because, you never know what's going to happen when you're unconscious. But yeah, that's going a bit too far. In 1966, when Robert would have still been 16 at the time, he was evicted from the old couple's house, as they found out that whenever the 9-year-old granddaughter visited the house, Robert would molest her. The girl's grandparents immediately went to the police and reported the abuse. Shortly after, Black lost his job and went to Kinlochleven, where he then lodged with a couple who had a 6-year-old daughter. Now, I don't actually know what happened in that case, because they must have reported it to the police, but obviously not a lot must have happened. But then again, he has moved since then. I'm not quite sure what the result of that was. But obviously shortly after this, Black lost his job and went back to Kinlochleven, where he then lodged with a couple who had a 6-year-old daughter. I don't know if he lost his job because of this sexual offence, or if he lost it for another reason, or if he, gave up his job because he was moving. I'm not quite sure of this. There's not the information out there. But I wonder if that when he went to go and live in this couple's house, he knew that they had a 6-year-old daughter, and that's why he decided to go to theirs, because he knew that he'd have easy access to a child that he could prey on. And to be honest, she's at an age where she probably wouldn't really know what was going on, and if he was in the house with her all the time, it's like easy pickings for him. And that sounds very insensitive, but it's very true, because he's a predator. And it seems to me like he's an opportunist as well. And that is often the case with sexual abusers. Within a year of Robert living with them, the landlord informed the police that Robert had been repeatedly molesting their young 6-year-old daughter. So it just shows that if there's a young child in the house, he can't be a decent human. He can't leave the child alone. He has to, play out his dirty fantasies on young children. After this, Robert pled guilty to 3 counts of indecent assault against a child and was sentenced to a year at Polmont Boardstall in Brighton's institution. The institution specialised in rehabilitating serious young offenders. There's not much information on his time at Boardstall, but it clearly didn't work out for Bobby, because 6 months after his release, Robert moved to London, where he initially found lodgings in a bedsit close to King's Cross Station. From 1968 to 1970, when Robert was around the age of 21 to 23, he had a few casual jobs. One was being a lifeguard, where he got up to his old tricks again, and he was caught funneling young girls. Look at that, he's got the opportunity. He's an opportunist. He's seeing these young girls in their swimsuits, and he's basically abusing his power. He's a lifeguard, He's there to protect these girls, but instead he goes around funneling them. It just shows what a horrible man he is. But luckily, he was actually caught in the act and fired, but no charges were brought against him. And at this time, Robert began to collect child porn, and this in the format of magazines and photography. Later on, he expanded this to include videos of children being graphically sexually assaulted. This is also when he would turn up to places like swimming pools and take pictures of children, mostly girls between the age of 8 and 12. and he'd store these pictures in a locked suitcase to fantasise over later. Also, when Robert lived in the London area, he would frequent the Three Crowns pub in the Stamford Hill area, where he became a darts player. This is where he met Edward and Kathy Rayson in 1972. He soon moved into the attic as a lodger. He remained living there until 1990. The Raysons found him to be reserved, have poor hygiene, but apart from that was a good tenant. They did suspect that he actually viewed pornography, but they wasn't aware that it was paedophilic. Robert later confessed that it was quite easy to get his hands on the child pornography, as he would engage in conversations with a man who owned a local bookshop in the King's Cross. Rob would ask for the adult movies and magazines and would be sent to the back of the bookstore. As the two created a rapport, Black would go on to ask for teen porn, which was the pseudonym for child porn. Now personally, I feel that the bookshop owner needs to be investigated, but I couldn't find any information about him. And this is because obviously a man in the bookstore has child porn. He's obviously up to some weird stuff himself. Anyway, moving on. Whilst living with the Raysons, Robert became a white van driver and got a job as a dispatcher at Ford Dispatcher and Storage Limited, where he developed an excellent knowledge of the UK road network. This would be important for Rob for when he was committing his crimes later on, as this enabled him to abduct children all across the UK, and he would dispose their bodies hundreds of miles away from where he abducted them. Black would often alter his appearance by shaving or growing out his beard and shaving his head completely bald. And he would also change his glasses, as he had dozens of pairs found in his van. This was to evade being caught, as by the time he had committed another crime, his appearance would change and the police would be looking for someone completely different. So if anyone was to give an eyewitness of him, they would give a false one, because he'd look completely different next time he committed a crime. So this would confuse the police and it would be harder for them to find him. Also, because he was moving all over the UK, he might not be linked to other crimes committed because of the location and the change of appearance. The back of the van was also covered with opaque black curtains at the back window, so no one could see into the van. And this is because Black would often have children in the back of his van for over a 24-hour period in between killings and in between dumping the bodies. During his time working as a delivery driver, Black kidnapped and murdered 4 girls between the ages of 5 and 11 over a 5-year period. He was convicted of sexually assaulting one of the girls and raping the other 3. He was also convicted of kidnapping a 5th and attempted killing of a 6th. Black's first victim was Jennifer Cardy, a 9-year-old girl who was abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered on the 12th of August 1981. She was last seen by her mum at 1:40 p.m, cycling towards a friend's house. The bike that she was riding was discovered a mile away from where she was last seen, and it had been covered with branches and leaves. It was likely that she had stopped to speak to Black, as her metal bike stand was pulled down and he'd probably persuaded her to get into the van, like he'd previously done with the girl before. And if you remember, he used a pretext of kittens being inside the bomb shelter. Her body was found 6 days later by fishermen in a reservoir. She had ligature marks, meaning she had been strangled and drowned, and she'd been sexually assaulted. The worst thing about it is that the coroner said that it wasn't the strangling or the sexual abuse that killed her. It would have been the drowning in the reservoir when her body had been dumped, which is just horrific. Imagine all those things happening to you. You know, you're being kidnapped, you're being tied up, you're having a bag put over your head, you're having a hood put over your head, you know. And then after this ordeal, you're dumped into a river where you can't breathe and you're literally drowning to death. And this is what unfortunately happened to Jennifer Cardy. Detectives concluded that after finding Jennifer's body, that the person who committed the crime must have known the area well. And with Black being a delivery driver across the UK, it is likely that he would have known the area well. But with killing, statistically people are more likely to be killed by someone they know over a stranger. So detectives didn't even think about this as a lead. They didn't think about someone like a delivery driver or Robert Black to be any way near involved. So they first investigated the family, the neighbours and other people, and it took a while for them to find out obviously it was Robert Black, because he had other victims after this. Susan Maxwell was an 11-year-old girl who lived on the Scottish border of Cornwall-on-Tweed. She was abducted on the 30th of July 1982. She was just walking home, which was only half a mile from where she was playing a game of tennis. And this was actually the first time her parents had let her leave the house unaccompanied. Can you imagine that? The first time you let your child leave on their own, you're thinking, they're coming of age, they're 11-year-old. I mean, even when I was a kid, when I was 8, I would walk myself home from my primary school, often with obviously other children. So you get to a point in life where you're getting a bit more independent, you want to do your own thing a bit more. And the parents must have thought, she's 11, she knows where she's going, it's only half a mile away, we'll trust her, she should be fine. I mean, at this time as well, people weren't necessarily vigilant when it come to, sexual predators and things like that, because it wasn't really something that you heard a lot about, because back in the day, obviously, they didn't have internet, it was, you didn't really hear of situations like this happening very often. I mean, a lot of time back in the day, they left their doors open, and you could leave your bike out on your front porch and no one would rob it. It's just the way it was back then. Anyway, back to the story. She was last seen by Karen Young at 4:30 p.m. Karen was actually 15 at the time, and she was with her grandparents driving into the Scottish border town of Coldstream, where she saw the 11-year-old girl walking over the bridge across the River Tweed on the 30th of July 1982. She was concerned that Susan was walking alone, as she remarked to her grandparents that it was Susie Maxwell. I know her and her family, and I thought it was very unusual for her to be walking alone, which she later told Newcastle upon Tyne Crown Court. The following day, a search took place, and they searched over 80 square miles for Susan. Susan's body was found 13 days later, fully clothed, and she had been gagged and bound. But although she was dressed, her underwear had been removed, and this signifies that she may have been sexually assaulted. The body was found in around the Uttoxeter area, which was around 425 miles away from where she had been abducted. It was believed that Black kept her body in the van for 24 hours, and this was while he was on his round delivering goods, and then he discarded her body on his way back to London. Now, to me, that means it's like discarding her body is like a second thought. He's got his rounds to do. He's more bothered about his job than discarding this poor girl's body. I mean, that is such a disrespect. Such a disrespect of this girl's little body. In July 1983, Caroline Hogg, who was only 5 years old at the time, was abducted from playing outside in her own garden. And to be fair, this is normal. Kids used to play out all the time. They still play out all the time now. She was in her own garden. She felt like she was safe. Her parents were likely watching her, but they may have turned around for a minute or two, or they had to go and do a job in the house. And it's so easy for a child to just get abducted that quick. And this took place in Edinburgh. A little boy who was also playing out at the time said that he saw Caroline with a man nearby the promenade. Now, with there being 2 killings of children of similar ages and the kidnapping of a third, police become aware of the connection. A massive police search was ordered. It was the largest search in Scottish history. Volunteers showed up in their thousands, and the abduction made headline news. The media is so important as well to get the exposure out there to the public, that there is a man out there targeting young girls. And after this, 9 paedophiles who were from the area were questioned, and all 9 of them were cleared. They all had alibis. This meant that the person who was responsible for the crime does not live in the area. Because of the media coverage, it meant that the public became more vigilant and would start reporting any unusual behaviour. Eyewitnesses said that the suspect was balding, unclean, he looked suspicious and was wearing horn-rimmed glasses. But like I said before, Black had many glasses in his van which he would use to disguise himself. The eyewitnesses noticed that Black was watching the girl playing outside and seemed to follow her to a nearby fairground. Jennifer Booth, a 14-year-old girl, actually seen Caroline sat there with this weird-looking guy. The young girl didn't hear the conversation that the two were having, but she heard Caroline say, "Yes, please." The young girl saw the man pay for Caroline to go on a carousel. This probably was how he got to build Caroline's trust, because bear in mind, the fairground is full of people and he did not want to look suspicious out there. She may have screamed, she could have caused a commotion, so instead of that, he manipulated her into buying a carousel ride. And this clearly shows that he's a very manipulative guy. You know, like before when he was young, I mean he was only 16 before, he was luring girls using the pretext of kittens. So it just shows that he's carried on this behaviour as he's got older and he's got even better at it. After he took her on the carousel, the little girl was taken back to his van and was in there for 24 hours, just like the victim before. On July the 18th, Caroline's body was found. She was left naked in a ditch close to the M1, 500 kilometres from where she was abducted. It was around 39 kilometres from where Susan Maxwell's body was found the year before. Because of the time lapse of when she was abducted and when the body was found, the coroner wasn't able to tell how she had died. But as he tends to have the same MO throughout, of strangulation and sexual assault, it is likely that this is how she came to the end of her life. From these few victims, it seems to me that Robert Black is an opportunist killer. If he comes across a lone child, he will use it to his advantage and abduct them. The following March, a reconstruction of the killing is broadcast on a TV. This becomes a big, well-known case. The police come to the conclusion that Susan's and Caroline's murders must be linked. The MO is similar in both, and they think that they are looking for one person. The police believe that the person is a van or lorry driver, sales representative, who must travel for work. An e-fit of the killer was also broadcast on the TV, as the two witnesses gave a description of the killer. Every one of the girls who he had abducted so far were wearing white socks, and it's believed that Black may have had a weird fetish for young girls in white socks. And this is part of the profile they were building of Black. The police start contacting travel companies, trade companies, and the person would regularly go to and from these areas. There was no breakthrough, but it now meant that there were 4 police services were working together to try and find this killer, and they all had the access to the database of information to work on. But unfortunately, Black wasn't captured yet, and another girl turned up missing. Around 7:30 on the 26th of March 1986, Sarah Harper from Leeds was asked by her mum to fetch a loaf of bread from the local shop. And this was only 100 metres from her house. She arrived at the shop and brought a loaf of bread and 2 packets of crisps, but never returned home. Around 7:55 p.m, a balding man enters the shop and leaves straight after Sarah. This is the last time she is seen alive by the local shop assistant. She starts to walk down the alley, but an hour later, her mum starts to get worried as she has not returned home. It wouldn't take her that long to get in there, grab bread and then walk back home, because as we said, it was only 100 metres away. Her mum and sisters started looking for her and could not find her anywhere, so they reported her missing to the police. A massive search is taken straight away. The whole of the local area is searched and they inquire house to house. They give out leaflets, there's underwater units and 200 volunteer searchers. From these inquiries, they found out that a white Ford van had been hanging around the area where Sarah went missing. Eyewitnesses mentioned 2 people who were in the area at the time, and one of the descriptions of one was of a stocky, balding man, which matches the description of the eyewitnesses of the previous murder. And this sounds just like Robert. Now, Jackie, Sarah's mum, also did a press conference to try and get public exposure, hoping that Sarah would be found. She said, "I just want her back, even if she's dead." Unfortunately, on the 19th of April, Sarah's body was found by a man just floating in the River Trent near the Wilford area of Nottingham. And to me, this is mad because during this time, my parents actually lived in a place called the Meadows, which is just across the water from Wilford. And they had young kids at the time as well. So to think that Robert Black was out there abducting, abusing and killing children, and this was in an area that is, known to me, where my family were, it just makes you think this could happen to anyone. She was found 17 miles away from where she had been abducted. This is 24 days later. Her body was partially dressed. She was also found gagged and bound. Her death was caused by drowning 8 hours after she was abducted, but she had received severe head injuries and was likely unconscious when she was thrown into the water. The pathologist also found that she had been viciously raped and had some of the worst injuries he had ever seen. Now Robert Black is getting worse, he's becoming more violent with these girls. He's doing, he's committing the crimes more often. He's advancing in his way of dumping the bodies. It can only get worse. It can only get worse. This guy needs to be caught. A witness contacted the police and said around 9:15 on the 26th of March he saw a white stocky balding man standing by a passenger door parked by the river door. The same description which was given by the witnesses in Leeds and the same description from the witness from the other murders, this led investigators to believe that Sarah's body was disposed of in the River Soar in Ratcliffe and ended up in the Nottingham River Trent. The police realised that because the killer is travelling so far, he will need to refuel. And this is quite clever actually. So they went and they questioned the workers at the service station located on the M1. The police were asking if anyone was acting strange, and one of the workers said that there was a white transit van that seemed out of place on the evening Black discarded the body. With all the similarities in the way the bodies were disposed of and the MO of the killer, the police identified the killer to be the same one who killed the other girls. All of the bodies were discovered in the Midlands and were in a 26-mile radius of Ashby de la Zouch. Sarah's murder prompted 6 police forces working together to try and find this killer. They now know that there is a serial killer on the loose. The police believe that they will likely strike again and put all the efforts and funding into finding this killer. They get in contact with the FBI because they have some of the top profilers of murderers who may be able to help. They made a profile of this killer. They investigated all the databases of child sex offenders and sex offenders. The suspect was narrowed down to 40,000 men, which obviously is a lot to go through, and more needs to be done. The profile of the killer that they came up with was that he was a white male between the ages of 30 and 40, but on the later age of 40. He was a classic loner, had an unkempt appearance, received less than 12 years worth of formal education, and lived alone in a rental accommodation. He was lower middle class and had a sexual fixation with children. It was likely he kept souvenirs, liked porn, and probably performed necrophilia on his victims. And necrophilia is when they have sex with the body after it is dead, if you didn't know that. On the 23rd of April, there is an attempted abduction of a teenage girl in the Radford area of Nottingham. This is seen as separate to the child killings mentioned before. This goes unreported to the senior investigators in the national manhunt. A white man in a blue transit van was sighted. Teresa Thornhill was really small for her age. She was around 4 foot, and he would have thought she was a lot younger than what she was. She had been to a local gathering with friends and was walking home with a boyfriend. As her and her boyfriend departed ways, a blue transit van stopped ahead of her, and he got out and raised the bonnet. He said to her, "Can you fix engines?" She replied no and carried on walking. What man would think that a young girl would be able to fix engines? This was obviously a way of trying to persuade her to get close to the van and obviously drag her in. And she obviously suspected that there was something fishy going on because she started walking faster. And because she's a bit older, she's more wary of people. As she walks away, Black grabs her and puts his hands around her nose and mouth. He attempts to drag her into the vehicle, but she kicks and screams, and he wrestles her into the van. But as he does that, she grabs and squeezes his balls. She must have grabbed them pretty tight, and that must have bloody hurt. And I'm so glad to hear this. And it hurt him so much that he let go of her and she bites him. He calls her a bitch and she screams and gets her feet wedged on the side of the door frames. And then her boyfriend, who was walking her home, heard and ran back towards her. And I'm so glad that he was there to save her, because that is another victim saved. You know, that is someone that could have been murdered, sexually assaulted, and ended up dead, you know, in a river somewhere. And I find it ironic that he actually called her a bitch. I mean, the girl's literally fighting for her life. She is fighting for her life. If she did not do what she did, she would probably end up in another river dead. And when her boyfriend comes back to her, he sees Robert and he shouts, "Let go of her, you fat bastard." And I must admit that these are such a brave young pair of kids. Her and her boyfriend run home and tell their parents what had happened. The police are called, both are questioned, and the description of the abductor was exactly matched to the FBI profile that was said before, and to the other cases that had happened. And this is when, on the 14th of July 1990, Black is arrested in a place called Stowe. David Herx, a 50-year-old retired postman, was in his garden mowing his lawn when he noticed that a blue transit van was slowing down to a standstill across the road. The man left the van and did what Herx thought was cleaning his van. At this time, a 6-year-old daughter of a neighbour of his was passing by. Hertz gets down and starts picking up grass cuttings from the ground. All of a sudden, he sees the girl getting lifted up from the pavement, and he watches the driver of the van push something into the vehicle, which he came to realise was a little girl. The van speeds off, but the man gets the number plate of the vehicle and runs to the girl's home, and the police are called. In minutes, 6 police cars go to where Herx is, and he describes what happened. And as he's describing what happened, a van drives towards them. He points the van at, "That's him!" The officer gets in the way of the van and pulls Black to a halt. Black is handcuffed and arrested. One of the officers found the girl in the back of the van tied up in the sleeping bag, to then realise that the girl in the bag was his own daughter. She was bound and gagged with a plaster, and she had a hood tied over her head. Unfortunately, the girl had been the victim of a very serious sexual assault. Black had absolutely no remorse and just said that he'd touched her up a little bit. I mean, wow, that is disgusting. What a dirty, horrible little man. I bet the officer wanted to give him a right kicking, because I know I would. This incident is connected to the other killings, and Black is questioned. He doesn't really engage with the police though. When the van was searched, they found restraining devices, sticking plaster, ropes, hoods and a Polaroid camera, clothes that belonged to the other girls, a mattress and sex toys. Black's excuse was that he would put children's clothes on and masturbate in them, and it gave him sexual gratification. He didn't admit to the killing of the other girls as well, and child porn was found in his home when they later searched it. A lot of it came from Europe as well, and it's actually expected that he abducted children from Europe also, and possibly killed them. Now, as I said earlier, I said that he likes to, he keeps trophies, and obviously these things that are in the back of his van are trophies, such as taking pictures with a Polaroid camera. He could look at this again and again and again and fantasize about what he did to these children. This would have given him sexual gratification, but obviously not enough to keep him going, because he would have to go out and murder again. They also found a Nottingham Evening Post article which was about the 1988 attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill, and this shows that he has a very narcissistic side, because he would read that and it seemed that he would be proud of what he'd done. As I said before, he was arrested and sentenced to 35 years in prison and given 12 life sentences, and he later died in prison at the age of 68 in 2016, where he's definitely not going to be missed, and I'm pretty glad that he's not there and he's not able to abuse any more young girls. And so that was the case of Robert Black. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who has listened. I know it was a bit of a heavy story, and I know it was a bit of a long one. I really appreciate your time, and I've just done my first ever true crime podcast. I found it interesting and informative, and will join me in listening to more of my crime or psychology podcasts. I've been Lena Rowell, and these have been my Psych Files. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and if needed, grab them by the balls. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.